While the effects of the failed mutiny in Russia are yet to be seen, it's at least become somewhat clear what happened from a territorial perspective. First, let's briefly look at who is Yevgeny Prigozhin and what is the Wagner Group. Prigozhin, originally from Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, had originally attempted to become a professional cross-country skier in the Soviet Union. When Prigozhin quickly flamed out, however, his life spiraled into crime, being caught stealing at age 18 and again more seriously at age 20, being convicted of multiple charges including robbery and fraud, as well as attempting to enlist minors as accomplices. Prigozhin ended up serving 9 years in prison and was released in 1990, 2 years after being pardoned. Shortly after, the Soviet Union imploded, and Prigozhin took advantage of the new business environment to become a food service magnate. He had started out by selling hot dogs on the street, but by the end of the 1990s, he had built an enormous catering and restaurant empire. Prigozhin also got involved in the casino business in St. Petersburg, where Vladimir Putin was a regulatory official supervising gambling. Putin's office was known for rampant corruption and illicit dealings. Later, when Putin became the president of Russia, Prigozhin's catering company began landing large government contracts. By the early 2010s, he was living in an enormous compound, owned a yacht, a helicopter, and numerous private jets, and became regarded by international monitoring agencies as one of the most corrupt figures in the world, not far behind Putin himself. In fact, it is suspected that many of Prigozhin's luxuries are used by Putin, who generally avoids direct involvement in corrupt activities to create plausible deniability. In the mid-2010s, Prigozhin started the Internet Research Agency. This is better known to the world as the St. Petersburg Troll Farm, which Russia uses to spread propaganda and sow chaos amongst its adversaries, including most famously during the election cycles of America and its allies. In 2014, during the Donbass War, the Wagner Group, or private military company Wagner, was founded. This occurred during the early phases of the Donbass War, which was marked by warlordism. However, the Wagner Group would shift the majority of its focus to the Middle East and Africa. There, the mercenaries clandestinely supported Russian interests while maintaining plausible deniability for the Putin regime. This was useful when, for example, numerous Wagner fighters were killed in an American airstrike during a botched attempted takeover by Wagner of an oil field in Syria. Perhaps Wagner's most notable recent overseas involvement has been in West Africa, where they've initiated coups and uprisings against several French-backed governments, most notably Mali, which have kicked out French officials and military, replacing them with Wagner-affiliated Russian counterparts. Through this, Wagner, and therefore Russia, have poked large holes in France's longtime sphere of influence in the region, including successfully removing several countries from France's sphere and adding them to Russia's own, at least for the moment. Throughout this time, questions remained about what exactly the leadership of the Wagner Group looks like. The group was founded and named after Dmitry Utkin, a former FSB-affiliated operative active in Ukraine in 2014, and codenamed Wagner, a reference to German operatic composer Richard Wagner, which Utkin reportedly chose due to his passion for the history of Hitler-era Germany, with the dictator having been a well-known admirer of the 19th century composer. However, while Utkin himself was the face of Wagner on the ground during its early years, it was long speculated that the financing actually came from Prigozhin. Prigozhin's involvement and visibility significantly increased when the Wagner Group brought the majority of its units back to Europe and began to take on missions in support of the floundering Russian regulars in Ukraine. Even as Russia was losing swathes of territory elsewhere, Wagner concentrated its efforts on the campaign to capture the city of Bakhmut, known to the Russians as Artyomivsk, its communist-era name. To break the stalemate, Wagner recruited prisoners in Russia, mostly hardened criminals who were unlikely to be freed otherwise, and presumably with government backing, offered them pardons in exchange for their services in Ukraine. Prigozhin, now visible on the ground as Wagner's de facto leader, threw the prisoners into the meat grinder in frontal assaults. However fatalistic, this strategy did work, and Wagner slowly ground its way into Bakhmut. Toward the end of the battle, however, as victory appeared within reach, Russian government support for Wagner was largely cut off. Not only was Prigozhin no longer allowed to recruit from prisons, but the Russian Ministry of Defense began delivering insufficient supplies, at least according to Prigozhin, most notably ammunition. During the final weeks of the Bakhmut battle, even as Wagner forces in the city continued to slowly edge forward block by block, Prigozhin became extremely outspoken on social media about his complaints with the Russian Defense Ministry, including one we've previously discussed, surrounded by the bodies of dead Wagner troops, and cursing out Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Army Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov. The conflict between Shoigu and Prigozhin only intensified after the victory in Bakhmut, as Prigozhin could now claim credit for Russia's only battlefield triumph in months, all while having accused Shoigu during the battle of undermining the effort. Wagner troops and Russian regulars also had a series of violent incidents, reportedly involving the kidnapping and torture of a Russian military officer. In early June, Prigozhin was again highly critical, as the Russian Ministry of Defense failed to eject Ukrainian-backed Russian rebels from the territory near Belgorod, something we discussed just last week. Shoigu, for his part, ordered Wagner dissolved and for all its fighters to sign contracts with the Russian Defense Ministry by the first week of July. Then, on June 23rd, the situation came to a head. Following the Battle of Bakhmut, Wagner troops had withdrawn to rear areas, setting up large encampments for their reportedly 25,000 troops. On the night of Friday, June 23rd, Prigozhin posted a video from the now smoldering encampment saying that the Russian Ministry of Defense had executed a missile strike, which he claimed killed 2,000 Wagner fighters. Regardless of the veracity of this claim, Prigozhin subsequently declared an armed conflict against the leaders of the Ministry of Defense and the Army High Command, referring of course to Shoigu and Gerasimov. Wagner began quickly taking control of highways and advancing towards Rostov. With next to no resistance, Wagner took full control of the city, including the headquarters of Russia's southern military district. Prigozhin was then seen at the headquarters negotiating with staff officers who later appeared flanking Prigozhin in several of his videos. Wagner also had captured the Rostov military airfield, though Prigozhin was less successful at co-opting the forces there, ending up in several skirmishes and without any pilots to fly the planes Wagner had now captured. Still, Wagner's ground force was reportedly 25,000 strong, with plenty of armor and munitions. There was also a report that Prigozhin had opened the local prison and was again recruiting inmates for his cause. By the end of the night, Wagner had captured a significant portion of the Rostov Oblast, with control of the city and the all-important M4 highway, essentially putting Prigozhin in control of all of southern Russia, cutting off Moscow's access to the Kuban and the Caucasus, as well as to the front line in the annexed territories, and of course to the all-important Crimea. The next morning, with the government response seemingly paralyzed, Prigozhin commenced what he called the Parade to Moscow. The majority of Wagner's armored units began moving north along the M4 highway, eventually coming to a halt south of the city of Voronezh. By this point, Wagner units had covered about half of the 800-mile distance from Rostov to Moscow. However, they met their first significant resistance. Government authorities set up roadblocks and created a traffic jam, while also bringing in air support. As fighting commenced in earnest, there was significant collateral damage, including a massive explosion caused by the destruction of an oil depot. As Wagner forces attempted to avoid the traffic jam and skirt around the city, they used anti-aircraft equipment to reportedly shoot down 6 helicopters of the Russian regular forces, as well as an aerial command center plane, resulting in 12 or 13 regular servicemen dead. With the stakes now raised and Wagner now past Voronezh, panic began to set in Moscow. Putin finally made a public statement, almost 15 hours after the saga had begun, declaring that he was not siding with Prigozhin and calling him a traitor, declaring, "This is treason." The convoy advanced through rural areas and approached the city of Tula, now under 200 miles from Moscow. With a state of siege declared in the Russian capital, Vladimir Putin's personal jet was recorded by aviation tracking as having quickly left the city for St. Petersburg. A host of Russian elites and officials would follow. The events appeared to be coming to a crescendo. However, in this decisive moment, the plug was pulled. What exactly happened is not entirely clear. One rumor was that the governor of the Tula Oblast, Duman, a close Putin confidant, intervened as a proxy to commence negotiations. The first word of a deal came from Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko, who announced that Prigozhin would lay down his arms, that Russia would drop the charges of treason, as well as any other prosecution against Prigozhin or his fighters, and that Lukashenko would be hosting Prigozhin in exile in Belarus. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov would later add that Wagner fighters could either sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense to join the regular army, and later reports emerged that alternatively fighters can follow Prigozhin to Belarus, where a new camp for at least 5,000 fighters is supposedly being constructed. For his part, Prigozhin did not say much, announcing cryptically that he had turned around because he didn't want to spill any Russian blood, despite his forces having killed a dozen Russian troops earlier in the day. Wagner also likely had losses of its own, although those numbers remain unclear. Prigozhin was seen getting into a car on the night of the 24th, leaving Rostov with his forces, and appeared satisfied despite his putsch being apparently stymied. This further lends credence to the idea that this deal may contain more than meets the eye. Alongside the open question of what happens to Prigozhin and his fighters, there is also the question of what the future holds for Shoigu and Gerasimov, as well as for those who might fill their shoes, such as Duman. Of course, the question overarching all of this involves Vladimir Putin himself, and what this event means for the future of his rule. So while the result of this putsch remains an open-ended question, the military situation has drawn to a close, at least for the moment. We'll continue to follow the situation closely as the results from the two-day uprising become more clear. A big thank you for watching this special episode. If you enjoyed it, make sure to give this video a like and leave a comment for the algorithm. For more geopolitics content, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell button. Check out the project that forms the basis for these videos at apoliticalworldmap.org. And if you can, please sign up for our Patreon and keep the videos coming. Thanks again for watching. I'm Alex. I am out.